You've heard people say it. Maybe you've said it yourself. Food was more natural 100 years ago. Our grandparents didn't have all these chemicals in their food. Before all this processing, people ate real food. The sentiment appears in conversations, in documentaries, in social media posts that contrast the long ingredient list on a modern package with the simplicity of what people supposedly ate in earlier generations. It sounds true. It feels true. It taps into a deep and understandable longing for a time when food was honest, simple, and made by people you could trust. And it is, by every measure the historical record provides, completely and spectacularly wrong. The records are not hidden. They are in government archives, in scientific journals, in the published findings of chemists who spent decades testing what was actually inside the food the public was buying. And what those records describe is not a golden age of purity. What they describe is a food supply so routinely contaminated, so systematically adulterated, and so comprehensively misrepresented that a modern consumer reading the inventory for the first time would struggle to believe it was real. It was real. Every example in this episode comes from documented analyses conducted by government chemists, independent researchers, or parliamentary commissions between the 1820s and the early 1900s. None of it is speculation. None of it is exaggeration. All of it was legal at the time it was happening, because no law existed to make it illegal. Start with the product you'd least suspect: tea. In the 19th century, tea was one of the most widely consumed beverages in the English-speaking world, and one of the most routinely and creatively adulterated. Government analysts testing commercial tea samples in Britain found a practice so elaborate that it constituted, in itself, a small industry. Used tea leaves, collected in bulk from hotels, coffee houses, and restaurants, were purchased by dealers, dried, and then treated with a series of chemicals designed to make them look and feel like fresh tea. Black tea was recolored with graphite, which the trade called black lead, rubbed into the surface of each leaf to restore the dark sheen that use had removed. Green tea, which sold at a premium, was tinted with Prussian blue, a synthetic pigment made from iron and cyanide compounds, applied to give exhausted leaves the bright blue-green color that consumers associated with freshness and quality. Some green teas were found to contain arsenide of copper, Scheele's green, a compound so toxic that it was simultaneously responsible for documented poisonings in homes where it was used in wallpaper dye. But the adulteration of tea went far beyond recoloring used leaves. Analysts found that the leaves of elder trees, willow bushes, and sloe were dried, shaped to resemble tea leaves, and mixed into commercial tea to increase bulk. Iron filings were added for weight. A consumer paying by the pound was paying, in part, for iron. China clay, soapstone, and French chalk were used as filler. Sand and quartz were found in some samples. And the sweepings from the floors of Chinese tea warehouses, the dust, the fragments, the detritus that accumulated during handling, were collected, compressed, and sold as low-grade tea to dealers who mixed them into their products without disclosure. A study from the period estimated that a consumer buying a pound of tea in London in the 1850s had roughly a 50-50 chance of receiving a product that contained something other than tea, and nobody was required to say so, because there was no label. If you've been watching this channel, you've heard some of these stories before, but never all at once, and never with the catalog that comes next. Subscribe if you haven't, because this episode is a tour through the grocery store your great-grandparents actually shopped in. And here's a question for the comments. Before this video, did you honestly think food was more natural 100 years ago? Tell us, because the records say otherwise. Coffee was worse. Harvey Wiley's Bureau of Chemistry, testing commercial ground coffee samples in the United States in the 1890s, determined that approximately 87% of all samples were adulterated. The adulterants included chicory root, a relatively harmless substitution that had been practiced openly in parts of Europe, but extended far beyond it. Sawdust, ground acorns, charred beets, roasted wheat, compressed dirt, date stones, ground figs, roasted hominy, and in the most industrious cases, pellets manufactured from mixtures of flour and molasses, individually shaped and colored to resemble whole coffee beans. A consumer who distrusted ground coffee and bought whole beans instead, believing them to be safer, could still be purchasing a bag in which a significant percentage of the beans had never been near a coffee plant. Bread, the most basic food in the Western diet, the product that working families depended on for the majority of their calories, was routinely adulterated with alum. Alum was a chemical compound borrowed from the dyeing and tanning industries. It made cheap, dark flour appear white and expensive. Bakers added it because their customers wanted white bread. White bread signified quality, freshness, and prosperity. And the cheapest flour, made from low-grade grain, was naturally gray. Alum turned it white. It was not in itself acutely poisonous, but it inhibited digestion and reduced the nutritional value of everything eaten alongside it, which meant that the poorest families, the ones who could afford only the cheapest bread, the bread most likely to contain alum, were getting less nutrition from every meal they ate. Bakers also added potatoes, ground bones, plaster of Paris, pipe clay, and lime to increase the weight and volume of their loaves. A loaf that weighed 2 pounds might contain only 1.5 pounds of actual flour. The rest was filler. The catalog of what was found continues, and it gets worse. Cheese was colored with red lead chromate, the same compound used in industrial paint and in the pigments that coated factory machinery. The lead was added to give cheese a rich, appealing orange-yellow color that consumers associated with high fat content and good quality. In an era before pasteurization, before refrigeration, and before standardized dairy practices, a block of cheese could vary enormously in color, depending on the season, the breed of cow, and the fat content of the milk. Lead chromate eliminated that variation. It made every block look the same. Analysts also found oleomargarine, potatoes, soapstone, and, in at least some documented samples of imported cheese, arsenic. Mustard, the condiment found on nearly every table in England and America, was, in the vast majority of commercially tested samples, mostly wheat flour. The bright yellow color that consumers expected did not come from mustard seed. It came from lead chromate, the same compound used to color cheese, the same compound used in industrial paint, added to a product that people spread directly on their food and ate every day. Plaster of Paris was added for bulk. Radish seeds replaced some or all of the actual mustard seed. A study from the period found that fewer than 1 in 10 commercial samples of prepared mustard contained nothing but mustard. Pickles owed their vivid green color to copper sulfate, an industrial compound that had no place in food, but that produced a shade of green far brighter and more appealing than the dull olive that vegetables actually turned after weeks in brine. Bottled fruit and preserves were treated with the same substance. So was wine. A consumer looking at a jar of bright green pickles on a grocery shelf in the 1860s was looking at a product that had been dyed with an industrial chemical, and the color itself was the deception. The green said fresh. The copper sulfate said nothing, because it didn't have to. Vinegar was, in many samples, not fermented at all. It was sulfuric acid diluted with water and tinted brown. Butter was stretched with cheaper fats and whitened with lead carbonate. Sugar contained marble dust, bone dust, lead, and, in documented cases, blood as a coloring agent. Candy and confectionery were colored with a catalog of substances that reads, in the official analyses, like an inventory from an industrial chemistry warehouse. Lead sulfate, bisulfate of mercury, Venetian lead, chromates of lead, arsenite of copper. The vivid green pigment known as Scheele's green, which had been linked to documented poisoning cases across Europe. The candies were bright, appealing, and marketed to children. The colors were the selling point, and the colors were in many cases derived from compounds that were simultaneously being used in paint, in wallpaper, in industrial dye processes, and in pesticides. Wine was sweetened with lead acetate, sugar of lead, and colored with Brazil wood dye. Port was routinely extended with spoiled cider. Beer was adulterated with strychnine, with copperas for color, and with cocculus indicus, a narcotic plant compound added to give weak beer a more intoxicating effect. None of this was secret. It was simply unregulated. There was no law requiring any food or drink to contain what it claimed to contain. There was no agency testing what was on the shelves, and there was no label, no ingredient list, no nutritional information, no disclosure of any kind, telling the consumer what they were about to eat or drink. The marketplace operated on a single principle. Whatever you could sell, you could sell. If you're still here, hit subscribe. Because the story of how this changed involves a German chemist who was driven out of England, a physician with a microscope, and the laws that finally forced the grocers to say what was inside. Here's a question. What's the most suspicious ingredient you've ever noticed on a food label? 200 years ago, there would have been no label to read. The first person who tried to change this paid for it with his career. Friedrich Ackum was a German chemist who had settled in London in 1793 and built a reputation as one of the city's most capable analytical scientists. He lectured on chemistry at respected institutions. He consulted for industry. He was a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He operated his own laboratory and trained students who went on to distinguished careers. He was, in every measurable way, an establishment figure, respected, connected, and credentialed. But in the course of his analytical work, Ackum had become increasingly disturbed by what he found when he examined the foods and drinks that Londoners consumed every day. The adulteration was not occasional or accidental. It was systematic, widespread, and conducted with a sophistication that suggested long practice. The sellers knew what they were doing. The buyers did not. In 1820, Ackum published a book that broke the silence. Its title left nothing to the imagination: A Treatise on Adulterations of Food and Culinary Poisons. The frontispiece showed a spider's web and a quotation from the Old Testament, imagery that made the book's argument before the reader turned a single page. Inside, Ackum documented product by product the adulterants he had identified in commercial foods, the lead in wine, the copper sulfate in pickles, the alum in bread, the Prussian blue in tea, the strychnine in beer. He described the methods by which the adulterations were performed. He explained how an attentive consumer might detect some of them, and, in the decision that sealed his fate, he named specific sellers. He identified grocers and brewers by name whose products his analyses had shown to be adulterated. He put their names in print, in a book that became an immediate bestseller and was translated into several languages. The reaction was ferocious. The grocers and brewers of London did not dispute Ackum's findings. They attacked Ackum himself. His character was targeted in the press. His motives were questioned. He was accused, in what most modern historians believe was a fabricated or grossly exaggerated charge, of mutilating books in the library of the Royal Institution by tearing out pages. The charge was never conclusively proven, but it was enough. The institution he had served withdrew its support. His position in London became untenable. In 1821, Ackum left England and returned to Berlin, where he spent the rest of his career as a professor of chemistry and technology. He never returned to London. The book survived his departure. The evidence survived. The adulterants he had identified continued to be sold in the same shops he had named. But the man who had documented them was gone, and his departure sent an unmistakable message to anyone who might consider following in his footsteps. Naming the sellers had consequences that the sellers were prepared to enforce. The silence lasted 3 decades. Then, in 1851, a physician named Arthur Hill Hassall received a commission that would change the history of food regulation. Thomas Walkley, the editor and founder of The Lancet, one of the most respected and most confrontational medical journals in Britain, had been watching the problem of food adulteration for years. Walkley was not a man who shied from controversy. He had founded The Lancet in 1823 specifically to challenge the medical establishment, and the journal had spent 3 decades publishing investigations that powerful people did not want published. Walkley knew that Occam's work had been sound. He knew that the evidence of adulteration was still accumulating, that the problem, if anything, had gotten worse in the 30 years since Occam's exile. And he knew that what was needed was not another book that could be suppressed, but a sustained weekly publication in a journal that the grocers could not intimidate. Walkley commissioned Hassall to conduct the investigation. The brief was simple: purchase food and drink from shops across London, examine every sample under the microscope, determine what was actually inside, and publish the results, with the names of the sellers. Hassall was the right man for the work. He was a trained physician and an expert microscopist. One of the first scientists to use the microscope as a forensic tool for identifying substances in food. Under magnification, adulterants that were invisible to the naked eye became unmistakable. A grain of chalk in flour could be identified by its crystalline structure. A fragment of bone in bread could be distinguished from starch by its cellular pattern. Copper particles in pickles, iron filings in tea, lead compounds in mustard. Each one had a microscopic signature that Hassall could read as clearly as text on a page. Over the course of 3 years, Hassall examined more than 2,500 samples of food and drink. He tested bread, coffee, tea, sugar, cocoa, mustard, pepper, butter, milk, beer, wine, vinegar, pickles, confectionery, and dozens of other products. He worked methodically, purchasing each sample personally, recording the date and location of purchase, and performing the analysis himself or under his direct supervision. His reports were published weekly in The Lancet under the title Analytical Sanitary Commission, and each one followed the same format: the product tested, the adulterants identified, the shop that sold it, and an illustration showing what the microscope had revealed. The illustrations were the weapon. Hassall's microscopic drawings showed readers, in precise and undeniable detail, what was inside the food they were eating. A drawing of bread showed the geometric crystals of alum alongside the irregular grains of genuine flour. A drawing of tea showed the fibrous structure of sloe leaves mixed among real tea leaves. A drawing of mustard showed the yellow angular fragments of lead chromate sitting among the round, smooth particles of actual mustard powder. The images did not editorialize. They did not need to. They simply showed what was there. And what was there was, in sample after sample, something the consumer had never been told about and had no way of detecting without a microscope. The series was a national scandal. The grocers who had driven Occam out of England 30 years earlier found themselves facing a very different adversary. Hassall had The Lancet behind him, a journal with institutional backing, legal resources, and no intention of retracting. When sellers threatened lawsuits, Walkley welcomed them. When the brewing industry protested, The Lancet published the next week's findings. The specificity was the power. Every named grocer was a potential defendant. Every published analysis was evidence that could be used in court. The grocers could not silence The Lancet the way they had silenced Occam, because The Lancet was not a single person who could be accused and exiled. It was an institution. Parliament, which had ignored Occam's findings in 1820, which had done nothing for 3 decades while the food supply remained a catalogue of fraud, was forced to act. Members of Parliament read the reports. Their constituents read the reports. The press reprinted the most damning findings. And the political cost of inaction, of allowing the food supply to remain unregulated while the Lancet published weekly proof that it was poisoned, finally exceeded the political cost of confronting the grocers. The Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860 was the first British law specifically addressing the contamination of food. It was imperfect. Enforcement was weak, prosecution was difficult, and the penalties were modest. But it established for the first time in British history the legal principle that selling adulterated food was an offense against the public. The law had gaps. It allowed sellers to argue that they did not know their products were adulterated, a defense that was almost impossible to disprove. It placed the burden of prosecution on local authorities, many of whom lacked the resources or the will to challenge established businesses. And it did not require manufacturers or sellers to list the ingredients in their products, meaning that the consumer still had no way of knowing what they were buying until someone tested it. Those gaps were closed gradually over the following decades. The Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875 replaced the 1860 law with stronger provisions. It defined adulteration in terms that could be enforced. Any product that contained a substance injurious to health, or any product that was sold as something it was not, could be seized, and its seller could be fined or imprisoned. The law gave local authorities the power to appoint public analysts, trained chemists whose job was to purchase food and drink from shops in their districts, test them in their laboratories, and report violations to the courts. The grocer who had once been answerable to no one was now answerable to a scientist with a microscope, a laboratory, and the backing of the law. The system was not perfect. Public analysts were underfunded in many districts. Prosecutions were still difficult. And the most resourceful adulterators found new methods that the law had not anticipated. But the direction was irreversible. The era in which a seller could put anything into food and face no consequence was ending. Slowly, unevenly, but ending. Across the Atlantic, the same arc was unfolding on a larger scale. Harvey Wiley's Bureau of Chemistry had been cataloging the adulteration of American food through systematic testing since the 1880s. His 10-part study, Foods and Food Adulterants, published between 1887 and 1902, documented what American consumers were actually eating, and the findings were as damning as anything Hassall had found in London. The Poison Squad experiments beginning in 1902 demonstrated that the preservatives the American food industry used without disclosure caused measurable harm to healthy adults. Samuel Hopkins Adams's series in Collier's magazine exposed the patent medicine industry, and Upton Sinclair's novel about the Chicago meatpacking plants created a wave of public outrage that Congress could not ignore. On June 30th, 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act established the first federal labeling requirements in the United States. For the first time in American history, manufacturers were required to disclose what was in their products. A can of food had to contain what its label claimed. A medicine had to list its active ingredients. A product that claimed to be coffee had to contain coffee. Not sawdust, not compressed dirt, not charred beets shaped to look like beans. The era of selling anything under any name, without disclosure, without testing, and without consequence was, in the eyes of the federal government, over. The law evolved. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 strengthened the requirements. The Nutrition Labeling and Education Act of 1990 mandated the standardized nutrition facts panel that appears on every packaged food product sold in the United States today. Each revision added detail, added precision, added requirements that reflected the growing understanding of what consumers needed to know. The modern food label, The ingredient list printed on the back of every package, every jar, every can, every bottle is the product of this 200-year fight. It exists not because the food industry volunteered to be transparent. It exists because a German chemist in 1820 tested what was in the food, published what he found, and was driven out of England for it. Because a physician with a microscope spent 3 years testing 2,500 samples and naming the shops that sold the adulterated products. Because a chemist in Washington ate borax with his Christmas dinner to prove that the preservatives the industry called harmless were not. Because a journalist exposed the patent medicine industry. Because a novelist described a meatpacking plant. Because, century after century, the people selling the food fought every attempt to require them to say what was inside. And century after century, someone found a way to make them say it anyway. The ingredient list is not a concession. It is not a courtesy. It is a legal requirement, one that was fought for, legislated, challenged in court, and enforced over the course of 150 years. And every item listed on it, every ingredient named, every additive disclosed, every allergen identified, every percentage calculated, represents a substance that, in an earlier era, could have been added to your food without anyone ever being required to tell you. The next time someone tells you that food was more natural 100 years ago, remember the tea that contained Prussian blue and iron filings. Remember the bread that contained ground bones and pipe clay. Remember the cheese colored with red lead, the wine sweetened with lead acetate, the mustard dyed with lead chromate, the candy painted with arsenide of copper, the beer dosed with strychnine, the sugar mixed with blood and marble dust, and the coffee made entirely of compressed dirt shaped to look like beans. None of it was labeled. None of it was tested. None of it was regulated. And none of it was natural. The only thing natural about the food supply of the 19th century was the willingness of the people selling it to put whatever they wished inside the package, and the inability of the people buying it to know what they were eating. The ingredient list on the back of the package you are holding right now is not a sign that food has gotten worse. It is not evidence that the modern food supply is full of suspicious chemicals. It is proof, documented, legislated, and enforced, that someone at some point in the last 2 centuries looked at what was actually inside the food and decided that you deserve to know. The list doesn't explain its own history. It doesn't mention Frederick Acum, who published the first expose and was driven from the country. It doesn't mention Arthur Hill Hassall, who named the grocers and changed the law. It doesn't mention the Prussian blue in the tea, or the strychnine in the beer, or the lead in the cheese, or the bones in the bread. It simply tells you what is inside, because someone proved what happened when nobody did.